Hi, I'm in this book here, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. We have been doing chapter 9, What Does It Mean Not to Teach or Have Authority Over Men? This is Douglas Moo, and he's addressing whether or not 1 Timothy 2:12 is only referring to husband and wives. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 12, many think that Paul, what he is prohibiting is not the teaching or exercising of authority of women in general over men in general, but only of wives over their own husbands. However, the wording and the context both favor the broader reference. If Paul had wanted to confine his prohibition in verse 12 to wives in relation to their husbands, we would have expected him to use a definite article or possessive pronoun with man. I am not permitting a woman to teach or to exercise authority over her man. I am not permitting a woman... just rereading that, sorry. Paul readily makes a similar distinction elsewhere in writing of male-female relationships. Women, he said, are to submit to their own husbands. That's Ephesians 5:22, Colossians 3:18. The context, verses 8 and 9, that's of 1 Timothy 2, clearly addresses men and women generally as members of the church, not as in Ephesians 5:22-33 and Colossians 3:18 and 19 as husband and wives, as members of family units. Is it not only husbands who are to lift holy hands in prayer, but all men, and not only wives who are to dress modestly, but all women? Therefore, the prohibitions of verse 12 are applicable to all women in the church in their relationships with all men in the church. In verse 12, Paul prohibits women in the church at Ephesus from teaching men and having authority over them. But we now face the crucial question: does this prohibition apply to the Christian church today? Almost the entire New Testament is written to specific circumstances, correcting certain false teachings, answering specific questions, seeking to unify specific church factions, etc. But this does not necessarily mean that what is written applies only to those circumstances. For instance, Paul develops his doctrine of justification by faith in Galatians in response to specific Judaizing teachers for a specific group of first-century Christians. But the specific nature of these circumstances in no way limits the applicability of his teaching. We might say that the circumstances give rise to his teaching, but do not limit it. This point is particularly important because some studies of 1 Timothy 2:12 imply that if one can identify local or temporary circumstances against which the passage is written, then one can conclude that the text has only limited application. This is manifestly not true. Therefore, the question to be asked of 1 Timothy 2:12 is, can we identify circumstance that limit its application to certain times and places? Many think so. And the suggestions about local circumstances that have been proposed are legion. Lacking space to deal with all of them, we will focus on the two that are both the most popular in recent literature and that we think have the best claim to be accepted. that Paul is addressing only women who have succumbed to false teaching at Ephesus, and that he is requiring only conformity to existing cultural concepts of the woman's role. The first suggestion emphasizes that 1 Timothy is directed throughout to the false teaching of Ephesus, and that 1 Timothy 2:9-15 must therefore be interpreted against this background. It is likely that false teaching does give rise to Paul's instruction in chapter 2, verses 19-15, but the crucial question is, how does it affect his instructions? As we have suggested above, we think Paul is correcting the erroneous views of the place of women vis-a-vis men taught by the false teachers, although our conclusions do not depend on this. And that verse 12 restates Paul's customary position on this issue in response to the false teaching. In other words, it was Paul's position in every church that women should not teach or have authority over men. He must give explicit teaching on the subject here simply because it has surfaced as a problem in this church. Yet this would be his position in any church, whether or not some false teaching required him to write about it. We think this reading of the situation is well grounded and in the actual evidence of 1 Timothy, and that any other reading must import ideas that are not plainly present. But the advocates of the view we are now examining go further, insisting that verse 12 is directed only against women who have fallen prey to the false teaching. Paul's purpose, then, is not to debar all women at all times from teaching or domineering over men, but to prohibit women who have succumbed to false teaching from teaching and propagating these doctrines. In our day, we obey Paul's injunction by preventing women who are ill-trained and under the influence of false teaching from teaching such doctrine. They argue Paul cites Eve as typical of what the women at Ephesus were doing, teaching false doctrine, and doing so without adequate preparation. Eve taught the man to eat of the tree, bringing the ruin of falling into transgression. Excuse me. The woman at Ephesus must not repeat her mistake by propagating false teaching and bringing ruin to the church. But this argument falls completely short of being convincing. Paul's reference to Eve in verse 14 is difficult, but there are two emphases in the verse that must be factored into any adequate interpretation: the focus on the relationship between man and woman. Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman, and the focus on deception. This latter point suggests that Eve stands not as a type of Ephesian women who were teaching false doctrine, but as a type of Ephesian women who were being deceived by false doctrine. Hence the need to warn them about learning in quietness and full submission. Verse 11. Paul says nothing here about Eve's teaching of Adam, which, had this been his point, he could easily have done. Moreover, there is no evidence in the pastoral epistles that the women were teaching these false doctrines. There is nothing in the Genesis accounts or in Scripture elsewhere to suggest that Eve's deception is representative of women in general. Does Paul care only that the women not teach men false doctrines? Does he not care that they not teach them to other women? More likely then, in verse 14, in conjunction with verse 13, is intended to remind the women at Ephesus that Eve was deceived by the serpent in the garden, precisely in taking the initiative over the man, whom God had given to be with her and to care for her. In the same way, if the women at the church at Ephesus proclaimed their independence from the men of the church, refusing to learn in quietness and full submission, seeking roles that have been given to men in the church, they will make the same mistake Eve made and bring similar disaster on themselves and the church. By rooting these prohibitions in the circumstances of creation rather than in the circumstances of the fall, Paul shows that he does not consider these restrictions to be the product of the curse, and presumably, therefore, to be phased out by redemption. And by citing creation rather than a local situation or cultural circumstance as his basis for the prohibitions, Paul makes it clear that while these local or cultural issues may have provided the context of the issue, they do not provide the reason for his advice. His reason for the prohibition of verse 12 is the created role relationship of men and women, and we may justly conclude that these prohibitions are applicable as long as this reason remains true. So I read quite a bit of what he had to say, but not full, so if you want the full, you should obtain the book. I'm going to link to a video called, and it's about myself, Leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. The first thing I learned was humility. I now knew that I knew nothing. Submission and quietness. That's how we all should learn to begin with, right? Thanks for watching.